When you hear the word chainsaw, you probably imagine lumberjacks cutting down trees, or maybe something from a horror movie. But the original purpose of the chainsaw was far more disturbing, because the first chainsaw wasn't invented for cutting wood, it was invented for childbirth. And the story behind it is even stranger than that. To understand why the chainsaw was invented, we have to go back to the 18th century. At that time, childbirth was incredibly dangerous. Today, if complications occur during delivery, doctors can perform a cesarean section, use advanced surgical tools, and provide anesthesia to keep patients comfortable. But in the 1700s, those options didn't exist. If a baby became stuck during delivery, doctors had very few ways to help. In some cases, the baby simply could not pass through the mother's pelvis. When this happened, doctors sometimes had to perform a procedure called a symphysiotomy. This involved cutting the cartilage and sometimes bone in the pelvis to widen it so the baby could be delivered. But performing that procedure with the tools available at the time was slow, messy, and extremely painful. Surgeons needed something better. In the late 1700s, two Scottish doctors began experimenting with a new surgical tool. Their names were John Aitken and James Jeffrey. They believed there had to be a faster way to cut through bone during surgery. So, they developed a device that looked surprisingly familiar. It consisted of a small chain with tiny, serrated teeth. The chain rotated around a guide and was powered by a hand crank. In other words, it was essentially a miniature chainsaw. But unlike modern chainsaws, it was small enough to be used during surgical procedures. The first surgical chainsaws looked very different from the powerful tools we know today. Instead of a motor, they were powered entirely by hand. A doctor would turn a small crank, which caused the toothed chain to rotate around a narrow metal guide. This allowed surgeons to cut through bone much faster than they could with traditional surgical knives or saws, and in theory, it made certain procedures more efficient. But even with this new invention, surgery in the 1700s was still incredibly brutal. Remember, this was long before anesthesia. Patients were often fully awake during operations. The chainsaw may have made surgery quicker, but it certainly didn't make it painless. Although the chainsaw is most famously associated with childbirth procedures, it wasn't limited to that. Doctors also used similar tools for amputations and other bone surgeries. At the time, speed was extremely important during surgery. The faster a surgeon could complete a procedure, the better the chances of survival. Long operations increased the risk of infection and severe blood loss, so tools that could cut through bone quickly were considered valuable medical innovations, even if the methods sound horrifying to us today. As medicine continued to evolve, surgical practices began to change. By the 19th century, doctors developed improved surgical instruments that were more precise and less traumatic. Eventually, the chainsaw fell out of favor as a medical tool. Advances in anesthesia, sterilization, and surgical techniques made procedures safer and more controlled, and the idea of using a chain-driven saw during surgery slowly disappeared from medical practice. But the basic concept behind the tool didn't vanish. It simply found a new purpose. In the early 1900s, inventors began adapting the chain and blade design for an entirely different task: cutting trees. Early logging chainsaws were massive machines. Some models were so large, they required 2 people to operate them. They were heavy, loud, and difficult to control, but they dramatically increased the speed of cutting timber. By the 1920s and 1930s, gasoline-powered chainsaws were introduced. These were smaller, more portable, and much more powerful. Over time, chainsaws became an essential tool for forestry, construction, and land clearing, and most people completely forgot about their unusual medical origin. Today, chainsaws are everywhere. They're used by lumberjacks, landscapers, and rescue crews. But they've also become iconic in pop culture. In horror films, chainsaws are often portrayed as terrifying weapons. Movies have turned them into symbols of chaos and destruction. Ironically, the tool that audiences associate with horror actually began as a device meant to help doctors save lives. The story of the chainsaw reminds us that inventions often change in ways their creators never expected. A tool designed for medical procedures eventually became a machine used to cut trees and scare movie audiences. History is full of inventions like this. Objects that started with one purpose and evolved into something completely different. And sometimes their original story gets forgotten along the way. So the next time you see a chainsaw cutting through a tree, remember its disturbing medical past. Do you think you could handle being fully awake while a chainsaw was used on you? This is only one of history's hidden stories. Subscribe for more sugar-coated secrets.